Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Jacob Harrington stood on the edge of the observation deck at Lunar Prime, the capital city of the moon colony. From his vantage point, he could see the sprawling network of domes and industrial complexes below, all connected by glimmering tubes and railways. This was the beating heart of the lunar colony, and yet, Jacob couldn't help but feel a gnawing emptiness. His speech from the night before echoed in his mind, filled with passionate calls for change, for fairness, for a system where the wealth generated by lunar resources benefited the people who lived and worked on the moon, not just the corporations siphoning it back to Earth. But all of that was over now. The election results had come in earlier that morning. Senator Clayton Vance had won, securing his second term in office with the overwhelming backing of corporate interests. Vance, a smooth-talking politician with a perpetual smile plastered across his face, had promised economic growth and stability. What he hadn't promised, or what he outright refused to even consider, was sharing the wealth with the people who made it possible. Jacob sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. His supporters had poured their hearts into the campaign, miners and scientists working side by side, rallying behind his message of equality. They had dared to believe that change was possible, that democracy wasn't just a hollow word on this barren rock. And now, all that hope felt like it had been ripped away, leaving Jacob to wonder if they'd ever had a chance at all. Jacob, a voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Dr. Elena Torres approaching. She was a tall woman, her dark hair pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail, and her eyes sharp with determination. A scientist at Luna Lab, Elena had been one of his most vocal supporters. Like Jacob, she believed that the lunar colony had the potential to become something far greater than just an extension of Earth's corporate machinery. "Have you heard from the others?" Jacob asked. Elena nodded. "They're waiting at the Union Hall. The miners are furious. They want answers." "Answers to what?" Jacob said bitterly. "We lost, Elena. The system worked exactly as it was designed to. We put our faith in democracy, and democracy gave us Vance. They're not looking for an explanation, they're looking for direction," Elena replied, her voice firm. "They still believe in you, Jacob, and you can't give up now." Jacob clenched his fists, staring out at the domes below. The corporations controlled everything: resources, transport, even the media. They had the power to shape public opinion, and they had used it ruthlessly to crush his campaign. But he knew that the miners, the people who dug into the lunar soil every day to extract the precious helium-3, were at their breaking point. They couldn't survive another term under Vance's pro-corporate policies. "We can't go back to business as usual," Jacob said, more to himself than to Elena. "We can't just let them grind us down." "Then don't," Elena said simply. Jacob turned to face her. "You're talking about organizing a movement." "I'm talking about nonviolent resistance," Elena corrected. "You saw what we accomplished during the campaign. We brought together miners and scientists, two groups that don't usually see eye to eye, and we gave them a common cause. That's a foundation we can build on. We don't need violence to make a change. We need solidarity." Jacob considered her words. The idea of continuing the fight, even without an official title or position, appealed to him. He had always believed in the power of people to come together and demand what was right. But he also knew how brutal the corporations could be in defending their interests. They wouldn't sit idly by while a movement threatened their stranglehold on the moon's resources. "Vance won't let us protest in peace," Jacob said. "He'll use the corporate security forces to crack down on any resistance." Elena nodded. "He'll try. But if we keep the movement nonviolent, if we appeal to the people's sense of justice, we can turn the tide. We expose the corruption, the greed, and the exploitation for what it is. People are already waking up to the fact that they're being used. We just need to give them a reason to act." Jacob stared into Elena's eyes, seeing the fire there. She was right. Giving up now would mean surrendering everything they'd fought for, and he wasn't ready to do that. The election had been lost, But the battle for the moon's future wasn't over. "All right," Jacob said, his voice gaining strength. "We'll organize a nonviolent movement, we'll rally the miners and the scientists, and we'll make it impossible for Vance to ignore us." Elena smiled, relief flooding her face. "Good. I knew you wouldn't give up." As they made their way toward the Union Hall, Jacob felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had lost the election, but the struggle for justice wasn't about political office. It was about people, real people who were suffering under a system that valued profits over lives. And as long as there were people willing to stand with him, he would continue the fight. The Union Hall was packed with people by the time Jacob and Elena arrived. The miners, still in their dust-covered overalls, stood in tight clusters, their faces grim and their arms crossed. Scientists from Lunar Lab, identifiable by their crisp white lab coats, mingled awkwardly with the miners, their usually calm demeanor replaced by a shared sense of frustration. As Jacob stepped onto the small stage at the front of the hall, the room quieted. All eyes were on him, waiting to hear what he had to say. Jacob took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their expectations. These were the people who had believed in him, who had fought alongside him during the campaign. Now they were looking to him for answers. "I'm not going to lie to you," Jacob began, his voice steady but firm. "We lost the election. Senator Vance and the corporations have won, and for the next term, they'll continue to control the resources of the moon. They'll continue to exploit us, just as they always have." A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd, but Jacob held up his hand, silencing them. "But that doesn't mean we give up. The fight isn't over. The election was just one battle in a much larger war for the future of this colony. We may have lost today, but we still have the power to make a difference. We still have the power to stand up for what's right." The crowd listened intently, their expressions hardening with resolve. Jacob could feel the energy in the room shifting, the people rallying around his words. "We're going to organize," Jacob continued. "We're going to form a movement, a peaceful, non-violent movement that will unite every worker, every scientist, and every citizen who believes in fairness and justice. We're going to show Vance and the corporations that the moon belongs to the people, not to the wealthy few who think they can control it." The crowd erupted into applause, miners and scientists alike cheering for Jacob's words. He saw their determination, their desire for change, and he knew that the movement was already beginning to take shape. Elena stepped forward, taking the microphone from Jacob. "We need to act strategically," she said, her voice clear and authoritative. "We'll start with work stoppages. Miners, we need you to organize a strike. Shut down the mining operations until Vance and the corporations are forced to listen. Scientists, we need you to halt your research and let them see what happens when the brains behind the colony's advancements stop working." The miners exchanged glances, nodding in agreement. They were tired of being treated as disposable tools in the corporation's endless quest for profit. The scientists, though hesitant, also saw the necessity of taking action. Without their research, the colony's technological progress would grind to a halt, and the corporations would have no choice but to take notice. Jacob watched as the crowd solidified their commitment. This was the start of the Lunar Revolution. Jacob stood at the back of the hall as the crowd began to disperse. People exchanged tense but hopeful words, energized by the idea that they were no longer powerless. Elena was right beside him, watching as the miners and scientists filed out, determined to act on their newfound resolve. "Think it'll work?" she asked quietly, her eyes scanning the thinning crowd. "It has to," Jacob replied, though a thread of doubt pulled at him. He knew the risks they were taking, especially with the corporations controlling so much of the moon's infrastructure. But he had no other choice. This movement wasn't just about resources, it was about dignity, about showing that the people of the moon had the right to govern themselves. The next few days passed in a blur of tense negotiations and quiet planning. The miners were the first to act, organizing an immediate halt to all mining operations across the lunar surface. For the first time in years, The drills fell silent. It was a small victory, but one that sent shockwaves through the corporation's boardrooms back on Earth. Vance wasted no time in responding. His government issued a statement condemning the strike as reckless and harmful to the colony's future. He painted the miners and scientists as radicals, intent on destabilizing the delicate balance of lunar life. Corporate security forces were dispatched to the mining sites, but they arrived to find empty shafts and locked doors. The miners had retreated to their homes, prepared to wait it out, refusing to give in to intimidation. Meanwhile, the scientists at Lunar Lab followed suit. Research came to a grinding halt as they withdrew their labor, refusing to work on projects that only seemed to benefit the rich and powerful. Without the scientists' contributions, technological advancement on the moon stalled, and the once promising breakthroughs in sustainable living and resource management became distant dreams. Despite the government's threats, the movement grew stronger. Citizens who had once been indifferent to politics now found themselves drawn into the cause. It wasn't just about the miners or the scientists anymore, it was about everyone who lived on the moon, everyone who had ever felt the weight of corporate control pressing down on them. Jacob and Elena worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. They organized rallies, peaceful protests, and distributed flyers across the domes, reminding people of their collective power. They spoke of justice, of fairness, of a future where the moon's wealth wasn't funneled to distant corporate executives but stayed where it was needed most. One evening, as Jacob sat in a cramped back room in the Union Hall, poring over the latest reports from the miners' strike, a knock came at the door. It was Elena, her face tight with concern. "Jacob, we've got a problem," she said, closing the door behind her. "What is it?" "They're planning something," she said, lowering her voice. "I've been hearing rumors from the lab. Corporate security is gearing up for more than just crowd control. They're talking about sabotage, taking out key infrastructure and blaming it on us." Jacob's stomach sank. "Are you sure?" Elena nodded grimly. "One of my contacts overheard a conversation between two corporate execs. They want to sabotage the Lunar Lab Research Center and make it look like our people did it." Jacob leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. It was exactly the kind of underhanded tactic he had expected from Vance and his corporate allies. They couldn't win through legitimate means, so they would resort to deceit and destruction, all in the name of maintaining control. "We can't let that happen," Jacob said, sitting up straight. "If they frame us for sabotage, it'll destroy everything we've worked for." "I know," Elena said, pacing the small room. "We need to expose them before they act." "We need proof." Jacob nodded, already forming a plan. "Get me the contact. We'll need details, dates, times, locations. We'll make this public before they have the chance to spin it." Elena left to gather the information, and Jacob sat in silence, the weight of the coming days pressing heavily on him. The movement was fragile, held together by the hope and determination of the people. If the corporations succeeded in turning public opinion against them, everything would fall apart. A few hours later, Elena returned with the information. One of her contacts had managed to intercept a communication between the corporate security forces, outlining their plan to sabotage Lunar Lab within the next 48 hours. "We'll release it to the media," Jacob said, studying the data. "But we need to be careful. If they suspect we're onto them, they might move up their timeline." Elena agreed, and together they crafted a public statement, outlining the corporation's plans and calling on the people of the moon to stand together in the face of deceit. They sent the message to every media outlet they could reach, bypassing the corporate tone channels and relying on independent journalists and citizen networks to spread the word. Within hours, the moon was buzzing with the news. People took to the streets in protest, denouncing the corporations and demanding an end to the sabotage plans. Corporate security forces were caught off guard, their covert operation exposed to the light of day. They pulled back, unsure of how to proceed in the face of growing public scrutiny. Vance, under pressure from all sides, made a public appearance to address the crisis. His usual calm demeanor was strained as he attempted to downplay the accusations, claiming that the movement was spreading misinformation. But it was too late. The people had seen through the lies, and they weren't backing down. In the following days, the protests grew larger, spreading across the entire lunar colony. Tens of thousands of people marched through the domed cities, demanding justice, demanding an end to corporate control. The government, faced with an increasingly united populace, had no choice but to acknowledge the movement's demands. Jacob found himself at the center of it all, the reluctant leader of a revolution that had started as a simple campaign for fair resource distribution and grown into something much larger. He stood on the steps of Luna Prime's central government building, addressing a crowd that stretched as far as the eye could see. "We are the people of the moon," Jacob said, his voice ringing out across the plaza. "We have worked, we have sacrificed, and we have built this colony with our own hands. And we will not be silenced, we will not be controlled by the greed of a few." The crowd roared in approval, their voices rising in unison. "We demand a government that works for us," Jacob continued. "We demand fair distribution of the wealth we create, and we demand that the corporations that have exploited us for too long step aside." The protests reached their peak as the corporate security forces, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people, stood down. Vance's government, once so confident in its control, began to crumble under the weight of public pressure. Calls for new elections grew louder, and even within the government itself, cracks began to form as more moderate officials started to break ranks with Vance. Finally, the pressure became too much. Vance announced his resignation in a brief, somber statement, admitting that his government could no longer function in the face of overwhelming public dissent. New elections were scheduled, and for the first time in years, the people of the moon felt like they had a real chance at shaping their own future. Jacob didn't run for office again. He had never wanted to be a politician, and the strain of leading the movement had taken its toll. Instead, he stepped back, becoming an advisor to the new government, ensuring that the policies he had fought for, a fair resource distribution, worker protections, and corporate accountability, were put into place. The moon began to heal. The miners returned to work, this time with the assurance that their labor would be fairly compensated. Scientists resumed their research, knowing that their breakthroughs would benefit the colony, not just distant executives. The corporate influence that had once suffocated the colony began to fade, replaced by a sense of solidarity and hope. Jacob stood on the observation deck once again, looking out over the domes and complexes of Luna Prime. This time, the view felt different. The air was lighter, the future brighter. The lunar revolution had succeeded, not through violence or force, but through the power of people standing together for what was right. Elena joined him, a smile playing on her lips. "You did it," she said quietly. "We did it," Jacob corrected, his eyes still on the horizon. "The people did it." As the two of them stood there, watching the moon colony begin its next chapter, Jacob felt a sense of peace wash over him. The fight had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. And now, the moon belonged to its people.